questions for Onur Mutlu. Just to give a quick intro here, I'm going to Zurich. I'm asked for a meeting with him, and if I'm able to have that meeting, then I would like to discuss a few things. So this particular episode is a preparation for that. If I meet with him, great. I can go back and see if I met all my points. And if I don't meet him, then, well, then take this as some sort of virtual conversation. But the point is this: Onur Mutlu is, I would say, one of the most inspiring professors in the comp sci space that I know, and particularly because he really looks at the world as an architect. And I think, what is an architect? An architect is the closest we have between a hybrid between an artist and an engineer. And I think comp sci, very much like building buildings, is exactly that kind of problem, because we need to always sort of look at the big picture of how we want to do things, and then try to be creative about that. And then we have to go back to the nitty-gritty and the detail. And I think this back and forth is really where Onur shines. So he is a prominent online lecturer. He's professor in Zurich also. And I've been using a lot of his courses as inspiration and learning for my own business. The purpose of Orange Capital Partners is to generate wealth by investing in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices with large impact. So, and compute is probably the core to all of this. In fact, if you really want to boil it down, wealth creation, at least for this part of the century, is still going to be driven by Moore's law. So anywhere we can apply compute to anything is at least promising to generate wealth. There's a lot of other factors, but the real wealth generation in a sense of very high compound returns has to be driven by compute, and therefore comp architecture is so important. And that's why I like to talk to Onur Mutlu. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's June 19th, 2022. This is Dall.E. It's a Sunday no update. For the year, we are down 49.8%. The market's down 22.8%. We're underperforming by 27%. So just real quick, again, I'm going to Zurich. I might be able to meet with him. If he grants me a meeting, great. If not, that's fine too. I'm going to prepare anyway, and this episode is a preparation. We talk a lot about reading, and we discuss all the books that we read throughout the year. And we don't talk enough about the sort of educational stuff we do. We haven't done conferences recently because of the pandemic. And we've done a lot of courses, mainly online stuff, but living in Silicon Valley allows you sometimes also to peek into Stanford and places like that, Berkeley. So we do a lot of that stuff too. In fact, I would say maybe 30% of our work is just purely educational. And, you know, as they say, your daily agenda is who you're going to be in 5 years. In other words, what you do today is who you're going to be tomorrow. So I think listening, reading, learning about comp architecture is just going to sharpen our view on comp architecture. And why is that important? And let's just start the conversation. So my first question to Onur would be, well, what are your thoughts on the comp architecture of an electric intelligent car? Let's put the electric aside for a second, but actually it's very important too, because we believe at Orange Capital Partners that this is the compute platform of the future, and I believe people like Apple also believe that. That's why they're so desperate to getting into that space. What is going on here? So I think at Orange Capital Partners, we've spoken about this in the past. We have this application of Moore's law to the digital space. We've seen that in the last 50 years. Starting way back with Turing, and then, you know, von Neumann, and then IBM, and then Microsoft, and Amazon, and Apple, and all that stuff. So what we're going to see now, hopefully, is the application of Moore's law to atoms, to physical goods. And maybe the car is the first big compute platform that will allow that to happen. And the question to Onur, therefore, is, well, how do you see the comp architecture, the design space for cars? Onur talks a lot in his lectures about the constraints of design. What are the constraints? It's power, it's latency, it's safety, it's cost. Let's leave those four out. There's others, but let's focus on those four. And the car certainly is a big chunk of those, particularly latency, reliability, safety, and power, those are very, very important things. So just to give a little example of, I believe, where Onur would go in this conversation, because his focus is a lot on data and memory, because the compute architecture of today is data-driven. It doesn't take Onur Mutlu to discover that. But what Onur does, of course, is try to find solutions for some of the bottlenecks. And one of the big bottlenecks is a memory, but meaning it's not just memory in a sense that memory is fine in a sense we can actually drive Moore's law on the memory side. The problem is the smaller we get, the more problems we have with data loss, with what he discovered actually with his group, the Rohammer problem on DRAM, which is kind of when you get too small on the DRAM cells, then you can have bit flips, you can have loss, you can be compromised, and so on and so forth. Now you can fix those things with error correction code, with other types of ideas, faster refresh cycles and those sort of things. But then you lose power and cost, and that's sort of the world that Onur lives in, at least in his lectures. And the question now is, okay, how do you see the car? What do you see on the electric intelligent car as sort of the big problems, design space, solutions? Maybe you've thought about it. This would be my first question. This would be my first sort of line of conversation. And of course, because this is now a preparation for the conversation, I don't really know where the conversation will go. Hopefully it goes in some interesting ways. I think the second part of the conversation I want to steer towards is the question of integrated versus horizontal. This is one of the big conversations, let's say in the investment space. Some people are saying that companies like Tesla are doomed because they're fully integrated and they have very high margins, but at some point everything will be horizontalized. And in other words, you have all these levels in the supply chain that will be commoditized, and then there will be these guys who assemble all of that stuff and they will win. Now, that's obviously a very simplified way to describe that, but you could maybe use the Android space as an example for that, where the only winner is really Google, that is applying software very remote from the sort of hardware and so and all that stuff, and making money with obviously search advertising. Now, I would just be curious in his views. Now, I have a guess that Onur will be on the side of fully integration, because he's also mentioned that in part of his lectures where he talks about memory and how important it is to be always thinking top down and bottom up. And I think he has a quote in one of his lectures where he says you have to look forward, backward, upward, downward, every which way you have to look. And of course, if you want to look that way, what that means is basically the following. Let me elaborate a little bit. He's saying, let's say as a design, let's say you're designing now a car, a compute for a car, basically a computer on wheels. Well, you have to look top down. So you have to look at, okay, what are my applications? And then what kind of hardware do I need to support those applications? So you need to look bottom up. Okay, well, what is even possible in terms of technology, engineering? What can I do at what cost, at what scale? Then you have to look forward, which is, okay, where do I want to be 10 years from now? Do I want to design a car that can, support a robo-taxi fleet, for example? Then I have to look back. Okay, let's look back. Where were we 10, 20, 50 years ago? How did compute evolve? How did memory evolve? All of those things. And what can we learn from the past when we look into the future? So that's kind of, I would say, his view. I mean, this is based on the lecture. And I assume he would probably be talking to me about how important it is to be integrated, just because it allows you to optimize on every level of the stack, and particularly new fields like, for example, an intelligent car. That is absolutely crucial. Onur, in one of his lectures, talks about how, let's say, when you know what kind of applications you're gonna be writing on top of your hardware, then you can optimize also the memory stack, for example, because let's say if the application is the kind of application that is going to consume a lot of memory, in the sense that it will continuously look at data and then go back and forth, let's say in a convolutional neural network, then you have to have a certain architecture also going down to the stack, even into the DRAM and things like that, where you might have more, let's say, processing in memory or things like that. So again, if you're able to go through the stack and also drive the stack. You don't have to do everything yourself. Like Tesla, for example, is not making DRAM chips, or at least not yet. But you can then talk to the manufacturers and say, look, we want those types of chips for our application because this is the kind of application we're going to write. I guess compute, and this is maybe, let's say, 2B, or this is still part of the second question, but I would like to talk to Onur about, okay, in general, compute is always in this struggle between how much should we do ourselves and optimize for in terms of like make this stuff here ourselves, and how much should we outsource to specific vendors who are very focused on one specific thing. I think Onur, again, in his lectures, is always a little bit sarcastic about vendors in the sense that, of course, they protect their business interest. They have, let's say, when it's about Rowhammer, I think he makes the point that maybe one could be a little bit more aggressive in solving some of the problems, but then the manufacturers have to also convey the secret sauce of, let's say, how they do error correcting code or those sort of things, and they don't want to do that. So there's, of course, and that's legitimate. I mean, people have business interest, but there's also the risk. I think it's not just business interest. I think the risk in terms of relying on vendors is always that vendors could be slow. I mean, Tesla has said many times that they don't want to rely on legacy supply chain, or they want to rely as little as possible because the legacy supply chain just doesn't go at the pace of Tesla. Now, I think the third question I want to ask Onur is how he sees my point. This is now me, I'm catching his brain in terms of like, why is it that compute is so important, and why do I believe that if we can apply compute to atoms, particularly, let's say, in life science and in the transportation industry, that's what we're invested in, that will drive enormous wealth generation. Now, I have my own thesis. It's based on Chiara Marletto's concept of Can and Can't, which is basically, or even back to Deutsch and Popper, that any kind of progress in life is always going to be driven by iteration. And compute is just another way of it to iterate. And that, therefore, if we sort of find ways to iterate faster, at lower cost, under reliable circumstances, with low power and all these things, that we can then go in the miniature, or we can go, let's say, like in a car, into transportation. We can also go big, supercomputer. Compute is substrate irrelevant. I mean, you could have a biological computer in form of a cell being introduced into our body, which is kind of an allogeneic CAR cell T therapy is, right? So that's the computer. And then we have a car can be a computer. We have the computers that we know, the servers and the personal computers and the iPhone. And then we could have even larger computers, like something like Starship going to Mars. So I'd like to talk to him about this. Again, I don't know where this conversation might go, but picking the brain of somebody like Onur Mutlu, I'm pretty sure some interesting stuff will come out of there, some interesting inspiration or just lines of thought. Fourth and last point I want to discuss, assuming I don't have too much time to spend, I could spend a week with him just talking and walking up and down the beach of Stinson or somewhere like that. But so the fourth point I want to talk about is let's call it the Dall.E question. What do I mean by that? Well, if we have, let's take a car. We have a car, and we can ask ourselves, how do we make that car more intelligent? And I think we've come to the conclusion as a research society, as a business society, as a community globally, that we want to use convolutional neural networks. And we want to go in that direction. In other words, or what Andrej Karpathy calls software 2.0. So we want to use data and then let the machine program itself based on the data. So that's what we call machine learning. And I think Onur certainly has a view on that. I mean, machine learning has been used within, let's say, computer design and chip design even before we already spoke about machine learning. But the point here is this: if we take a car, and we can have two ways to teach that car how to drive. One is the one we're using right now, which is we basically build a computer on wheels that is software 2.0 enabled and has all the Onur Mutlu software design space constraints within it, and then it reads data, learns how to drive, and then keeps driving. Hopefully at one point we can go to full self-driving The other would be that we don't do it on the physical, but we do it on the virtual side. That's why I call it Dall.E question. So if we could have a realistic representation of the world, sort of a virtual world, but that is real in a sense that is rooted in the real world, a little bit like GPT-3 and these types of transformers are rooted in real texts, but then allow you to construct new types of texts and allow you, more importantly, to iterate around words and text. If we could have the same thing with video, and we could then actually have a sort of a virtual representation of the real world and have a car learn in a video like that, in an animated world like that, have a car learn through billions and billions of iterations with self-supervised reinforcement learning, the same way, let's say, AlphaGo Zero learned how to play a Go. If we could do that, we would have a potential to then have full self-driving achieved in a different way, much faster. And again, this is something I'd like to talk to him about. What are his thoughts on that? So to summarize, the four things I want to talk to Onur Mutlu about are, first, the design space of an intelligent car, the four things: power, reliability, security, and cost. Of course, how does he think about that? What are the interesting, what's upside, what's downside here? In general, how does he think about this? Number two, what are his thoughts on fully integrated versus not fully integrated in general, and then particularly applied to the car? Number three, what are his thoughts on the application of Moore's law onto atoms at any scale, from cells, biology, all the way up to cars and starships? So we can, of course, use compute in many different ways, not just in the sort of narrow way that we use it today. And fourth, what I want to talk to him about is sort of the idea, what I call the Dall.E question. Does he think that we can build machines like cars that can use software 2.0 type concepts to learn how to drive? Or should we more focus on a virtual world, of a representation of the real world in terms of virtual world, and then use self-supervised reinforcement learning? Thank you.